Yesterday, without realizing it, your brain may have changed the way you feel the world. A single conversation, a fleeting doubt, a breath you didn't notice, all of it rewired something inside you. And the strangest part, none of it depended on your will. Beneath your awareness, circuits shifted, emotions recalibrated, identity adjusted by a fraction. But when does this invisible transformation happen? What triggers your brain to reconfigure itself, sometimes propelling you into evolution, other times trapping you in old pain? Today, we step into that silent moment where change begins before you even know it's happening. There is a moment, silent, microscopic, and yet monumental, when your brain quietly decides to change the architecture of who you are. It doesn't announce itself. There's no inner voice saying, "Now I'm rewiring." It simply happens, as if an unseen hand inside you flipped a hidden switch. 1 second, an old emotion is in control. The next, it loses its grip, and a new circuit begins to form. You might think transformation is born of grand decisions, the day you quit a job, forgive someone, or finally say no. But the brain rarely waits for drama. It alters itself in tiny increments below the threshold of your awareness. A thought repeated, a reaction avoided, a sigh released at the right time. Each becomes a signal, and the neural web, always listening, updates its map accordingly. Neuroscientists call this spontaneous neuroplasticity, the brain's innate ability to remodel itself without conscious command. It's the same invisible process that allows a child to master language or a pianist to refine touch through practice. Yet the most fascinating aspect is that it can occur even when you're doing nothing. When you simply pause, hesitate, or reconsider, electrical storms within milliseconds reshape the terrain of connection. Picture it. Inside your skull, billions of neurons fire in fractal patterns. Each firing strengthens or weakens bonds with its neighbors. When you rethink a long-held belief or let go of a resentment, a cascade of synapses quietly reorganizes. It's as if the architecture of thought melts for a fraction of a second, then solidifies again in a new form, sculpted by your latest experience. But here's the paradox. Most people live this transformation on autopilot. The rewiring goes on whether or not you guide it, and when you ignore it, the environment takes over. The endless repetition of habits, scrolling, reacting, complaining, etches grooves into neural pathways. The mind becomes a loop machine, rehearsing the same emotional script until it feels like identity. Imagine your daily patterns as wind-carving stone. Each reaction, each mental replay deepens the same lines in the cortex. The more often you revisit anger or self-doubt, the more the brain interprets them as essential survival programs. Slowly, you stop choosing. The environment chooses for you. Your neurons start predicting the next emotional state before you even notice a trigger. This is the hidden danger of automatic repetition. While your conscious attention is distracted, the subconscious mind writes its own code, reinforcing whichever states you repeat most often. The brain's plasticity doesn't discriminate. It doesn't ask whether a circuit serves your evolution or your suffering. It simply strengthens whatever you practice. So the real question isn't, is my brain changing? It's who or what is changing it. At this very instant, as your eyes move across these lines, your brain is subtly adapting. It's estimating patterns, recalibrating expectations, forming associations with tone, rhythm, even silence. A few seconds from now, it will not be exactly the same organ it was when you began reading. And the most striking part, you didn't have to decide for that to happen. Still, buried within this automatic machinery lies a possibility, one that could shift everything. If the brain is capable of spontaneous transformation, then conscious influence is not about control, it's about cooperation. You don't force the rewiring, you witness it. You become the observer that notices which thoughts repeat, which emotions crave attention, which impulses tighten your chest before you act. In that witnessing, a new kind of signal is sent, subtle but decisive. Observation itself begins to modify the pattern. The very act of noticing changes the probability of what fires next. This is the bridge between biology and awareness, the recognition that presence is participation. Somewhere, deep within the thicket of your neurons, Another invisible moment is approaching, the one where the illusion of control starts to crack. You'll soon see that what feels like a conscious choice may already have been decided before you even thought it. But before we reach that paradox, stay here in this silence where the brain rewires in secret. Notice the faint hum behind every thought. That's the sound of your evolution, unfolding quietly, without permission. There's a kind of hypnosis that doesn't look like hypnosis at all. It doesn't involve swinging pendulums or a calm voice guiding you into trance. It happens every time you wake up and repeat the same thoughts you had yesterday. Every time you feel the same irritation in traffic, scroll through the same feeds, speak the same complaint, sigh the same way. Each repetition is a quiet rehearsal, and your brain, loyal to a fault, keeps learning it. Neurons are obedient servants. They strengthen whatever they're told to repeat, no matter how harmful or trivial. When you think the same thought, the electrical signal travels the same pathway, and the connection between those neurons becomes more efficient. After enough repetitions, it no longer feels like repetition. It feels like you. The pattern hides behind the mask of personality. You might think habit is just behavior, but it's architecture. Every automatic reaction is carved into the structure of your nervous system. The more a pathway is used, the thicker its insulation, the faster its transmission. What began as a temporary association becomes a superhighway of automatic responses. Anger, worry, judgment, self-criticism, once they've been rehearsed enough, they don't wait for your permission. They fire first. That's the fatal mistake, believing you're choosing, when in reality, your neurons already have. The environment supplies the trigger, your brain supplies the script. A sound, a face, a word, and suddenly you're replaying an emotion from years ago as if it just happened. You may call it memory or instinct, but it's often nothing more than neuromomentum, the brain following the easiest path. And the brain loves efficiency more than truth. It doesn't ask whether a habit serves your growth or your decline. It simply strengthens what costs the least energy. If a negative thought has been repeated 1,000 times, the neural pathway becomes so smooth that it outcompetes new possibilities. That's why trying to think positive rarely works for long. You're fighting against a deeply grooved electrical terrain that resists new direction. Imagine a river that's run through the same valley for centuries. Each season of rain deepens the channel until the water no longer has a choice but to flow there. Your attention works the same way. Every moment you focus on what's familiar, whether joy or despair, you send another drop of energy down the same emotional channel. Eventually it becomes a canyon. You call it who I am. What makes this dangerous isn't just that you reinforce the past, it's that the brain starts predicting it. It begins to anticipate emotions before the external event even happens. You wake up already rehearsing stress, priming your body with the chemistry of a day that hasn't begun. Cortisol levels rise, heart rhythms adapt, and your cells memorize the pattern of tension. The mind doesn't just remember pain, it prepares for it. That's how suffering becomes self-sustaining, not through punishment but through practice. Each time you relive an old story, the body treats it as real, and because the brain can't distinguish between imagination and experience, both build the same circuits. Your biology becomes a biography looping in slow motion, but there's a moment, so small it often passes unnoticed, when the repetition can be interrupted. It's that instant, right before the old reaction ignites, when you feel the pull to say the same thing, defend the same wound, think the same thought. If you can remain conscious in that fraction of a second, something remarkable happens. The electrical impulse hesitates. The neurons wait. A microscopic pause opens, and within it, the potential for a new pattern flickers to life. That pause is the first sign of freedom. Not a grand enlightenment, but a shift in circuitry. Awareness itself begins to compete with repetition. It doesn't erase old pathways, it simply stops feeding them. The less energy you give to automatic thought, the more those connections weaken through a process called synaptic pruning. The brain conserves only what you use. What you neglect begins to dissolve. And yet the danger persists because the mind craves familiarity more than clarity. It will fight to preserve what it knows, even when that knowledge hurts. That's why real transformation feels uncomfortable at first. It threatens the comfort of efficiency. The brain resists uncertainty the way the body resists cold water, but that discomfort is proof that something new is trying to form. Somewhere inside that resistance, a question begins to echo. If my brain keeps repeating the past, who's really in charge of my choices? You may feel you're deciding, but what if the decision was already made, milliseconds before awareness caught up? That illusion of control is where the next mystery begins to unfold. You believe you decide. You feel the thought rise, the intention form, the hand move, and it seems perfectly obvious that you were the one in control. But neuroscience tells a stranger story. Before you even think you've made a choice, your brain has already begun to act. In the early 1980s, the physiologist Benjamin Libet placed electrodes on volunteers' scalps and asked them to flex a finger whenever they felt like it. What he discovered changed the way science understood free will. The electrical activity that prepared the muscles to move, the readiness potential, appeared nearly half a second before the participants consciously decided to move. In other words, by the time you feel like you've chosen, your brain has already started executing. Half a second doesn't sound like much, but in neurological terms, it's a lifetime. It means that what you experience as a decision is more like an afterthought, a narrative your consciousness builds to keep the illusion of authorship intact. Your awareness arrives late to the party, sees what the brain is doing, and claims, "I did that." This delay doesn't stop at simple motor actions. Imaging studies show that patterns in the brain can predict complex choices. What movie you'll select, what word you'll say, even whether you'll press left or right, several seconds before you consciously decide. It's as if consciousness is a news anchor reporting events that the newsroom of neurons has already written. The unsettling part isn't that your brain makes decisions first, it's that you still feel like the one deciding. The self you call I seems to hover above the machinery, steering it with intention. But what if intention itself is just another echo, an interpretation your brain creates to make sense of its own impulses? Picture a wave rolling toward shore. You can stand at the edge and believe you're commanding it, but the tide was set in motion long before you arrived. The same is true inside you. Millions of micro-decisions, chemical, electrical, emotional, are constantly unfolding beneath awareness. By the time they surface, the outcome is already written in neural ink. This doesn't mean you're a puppet. It means free will may work differently than you think. Consciousness doesn't initiate every act. It filters and interprets them. It decides which impulses to amplify and which to inhibit. You might not choose the first thought that appears, but you can choose whether to identify with it. In that split-second window between impulse and action, influence still exists. Most of the time, though, we miss that window. We rush to justify what the brain has already done. We explain our anger, our purchases, our desires, as if reason came first, when reason is often just the narrator cleaning up after instinct. The danger of this illusion is subtle. You begin to believe your explanations more than your experience. You mistake the story for the source. And yet, within this revelation hides a strange freedom. If consciousness isn't the first to act, it can still become the first to observe. Observation changes the game. When you notice a thought rising without claiming it, you create space where none existed before. In that space, choice becomes possible again, not as command but as cooperation. The brain is like an orchestra that sometimes plays before the conductor lifts the baton, but a conductor still matters, not to force every note, but to shape how the music unfolds. Your awareness can't stop impulses from arising, but it can guide how long they play, how loud they grow, and whether they resolve into harmony or noise. Consider how many times you've said, "I don't know why I did that." That confusion is the trace of this phenomenon, the gap between the brain's timing and your awareness of it. The question isn't why you did it, but when the doing truly began. Somewhere between the readiness potential and the conscious realization lies a silent field of probabilities where neural signals compete for dominance. That's where your participation begins, not as controller, but as witness. Because when you start observing the mechanics of your own mind, something subtle shifts. The machinery doesn't vanish, but it slows just enough for you to see its gears turning. And in that pause, like a breath held before the next impulse, a new kind of clarity emerges. It's in that clarity that the next realization dawns. Understanding this hidden choreography isn't a loss of control, it's liberation. Because if the brain is constantly shaping your reality behind the curtain, then learning to influence when and how it changes might be the most powerful act of all. And that realization is where the next doorway opens, the discovery that control, paradoxically, begins the moment you stop trying to force it. When people first hear that the brain makes decisions before consciousness catches up, something inside tightens. It feels unfair, almost mechanical. If my neurons are acting on their own, where am I in all this? But that discomfort, if you stay with it, can transform into something astonishing, relief. Because what looks like the loss of control is actually the first glimpse of a deeper kind of freedom. Think of it this way. The mind is not a single voice, but an ecosystem. Thoughts, impulses, memories, sensations, all moving at different speeds, overlapping, reacting. Consciousness isn't the dictator of this system. It's the environment that allows all of it to exist, and an environment doesn't need to command the weather to influence it. It simply notices the climate, adjusts its balance, and lets new patterns emerge. The discovery that the brain acts before you decide doesn't mean you are powerless. It means the old idea of control, the constant struggle to force your mind into obedience, was never real. The true influence comes not from domination, but from relationship. When you observe the brain's automatic choreography with clarity, it begins to adjust its rhythm. Awareness itself becomes a biological signal. Neuroscience is starting to confirm what ancient contemplative traditions hinted at. Attention is not passive. When you focus on a thought, emotion, or sensation, neural circuits related to that focus become stronger. When you stop feeding them, they weaken. It's not magic, it's energy allocation. The brain updates itself according to where consciousness lingers. That's why this realization is liberating. You don't need to fight the unconscious, you need to illuminate it. Once you see that every impulse arises on its own, you stop taking each one personally. A thought appears, fine. A reaction pulses through the body, fine. The moment you witness it without immediately obeying it, the brain registers something new. Choice through awareness, rather than resistance. For years, you might have tried to control your mind, forcing yourself to think better, be calmer, stay positive. But the more you tried, the tighter the system became. Now imagine replacing that struggle with observation. The next time irritation surges or fear tightens your chest, don't rush to suppress it. Watch it like weather forming in the distance. Feel the chemistry move through you without labeling it good or bad. In that small act, the brain receives new data. It learns that not every stimulus requires an automatic reaction. This is the first taste of conscious neuroplasticity, the understanding that awareness alone can reshape the nervous system. When you stay present with an emotion instead of escaping it, you're teaching your neurons a new pattern, coexistence without defense. Over time, this rewires the amygdala's reactivity and strengthens the prefrontal cortex's regulation. Meditation studies have shown measurable increases in gray matter density in areas related to emotional balance and empathy. The science mirrors the experience. Attention reorganizes matter. And here lies the quiet revolution. Real transformation doesn't come from suppressing the unconscious, but from befriending it. The mind begins to trust its own observation. The body learns that presence is safety. Slowly, the space between stimulus and response expands, and within that space, a different intelligence begins to act, an intelligence that isn't hurried, reactive, or defensive. You can sense it even now, a stillness behind the noise, a kind of neutral witness watching your thoughts assemble and dissolve. That stillness isn't separate from you. It is you, experienced from the perspective of awareness rather than identity. And the more time you spend resting in it, the more the brain begins to favor coherence over chaos. What once felt like a battle, me versus my mind, turns into a conversation. You start noticing that emotions are messages, not enemies. That tension in the body is information, not punishment. Each observation sends a gentle instruction to the nervous system. Adjust. Slowly, the invisible machinery begins to respond. The realization deepens. You don't need to fix your brain to evolve. It's already designed to evolve through observation. The circuits of fear, judgment, and repetition only dominate when they're unobserved. The moment you notice them clearly, the grip loosens, and the brain begins to reorganize toward balance. This understanding opens a new kind of confidence, not the arrogance of control, but the serenity of participation. You realize that awareness is an active force, not a spectator. And if presence itself can influence biology, then even suffering carries within it the seed of transformation. But that insight leads to a more haunting truth. If awareness can shape the brain toward peace, it can also adapt perfectly to pain. The same flexibility that frees you can enslave you if it's left unattended, because the brain, in its loyalty, will adapt to whatever it repeats, even suffering. And that realization is where the next revelation begins. The brain doesn't care if something feels good or bad. It only cares if it's predictable. Predictability is safety to a nervous system built for survival, not happiness. So when pain becomes constant, when stress, criticism, or loneliness repeat enough times, the brain stops resisting. It adapts. It begins to treat suffering as familiar ground, and familiarity always wins over uncertainty. This is the hidden danger no one warns you about. The mind can normalize misery. It can build comfort inside discomfort. You wake up each day rehearsing the same thoughts, carrying the same heaviness, and although you don't want it, part of you feels strangely at home in it. That's not weakness. It's neuroplasticity doing its job. The circuits that fire together wire together, and if pain fires often enough, the brain wires itself to expect it. There's a kind of addiction that has nothing to do with substances. It's the addiction to emotional repetition. You might hate feeling anxious or rejected or unworthy, but those feelings are known territories. They tell your brain who you are in the story. Lose them, and you risk losing the sense of self they've built around you. The mind clings to what it knows, even when it hurts. Studies on trauma survivors have revealed something paradoxical. When peace finally arrives, it often feels unbearable. Stillness can trigger panic because the brain, trained to operate in survival mode, doesn't yet trust calm. It looks for danger in quiet places. It replays old fears to fill the silence. This is not because you're broken, it's because your neurons have learned that vigilance is safety. Imagine your brain as a thermostat. It calibrates to whatever emotional climate it experiences most. Live long enough in chaos, and chaos becomes the new equilibrium. When serenity appears, the system interprets it as imbalance and tries to restore normal, which tragically means stress. That's why many people unconsciously sabotage peace. It doesn't match their brain's settings. And the body plays along. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline become baseline chemistry. The nervous system learns to stay slightly activated, heart rate elevated, breath shallow, muscles ready for a blow that never comes. Over time, the brain links this physiological tension to identity. This is me, it assumes. The calm version feels foreign, maybe even unsafe. Here's the most sobering truth. The brain's ability to adapt to suffering is infinite. You can live decades inside patterns that quietly reinforce pain, believing that's just how life feels. But deep beneath the repetition, something in you knows it isn't. There's a signal, a low hum of awareness, trying to remind the system that it was designed not just to survive, but to transform. You can sense it when exhaustion stops being purely physical and turns existential. When the thought, "I can't live like this anymore," arises, it's not defeat. It's the nervous system asking for recalibration. It's the brain whispering, "This pattern has run its course." That's the moment of possibility, the crack in the automatic loop where consciousness can step in. Change begins when you stop judging the pain and start studying it. Observation dismantles the illusion of permanence. If you can feel a state, you're already larger than it. Each time you watch an emotion without merging with it, the brain receives new feedback. This isn't identity, it's activity. And activity can change. You don't heal by erasing pain. You heal by teaching the brain to stop worshipping it. You show it, moment by moment, that safety exists beyond repetition. The more you experience stillness without panic, the more the nervous system rewires its baseline toward peace. It's not quick, but it's exact. The same mechanism that once built suffering now builds coherence. And that realization is powerful. Adaptation isn't the enemy, it's the instrument. Once you know that the brain adapts to whatever you feed it, responsibility transforms into empowerment. You can choose new inputs, moments of presence, gratitude, conscious breathing, silence that doesn't terrify but restores. If you're reading this and something in you recognizes the cycle, if you felt trapped in the same emotion for too long, pause here. Breathe once, fully. Then write in the comments, "My brain can learn peace." Say it like a declaration, not a wish, because each time you articulate a new possibility, your brain listens. And the moment it listens, the rewiring has already begun. Now that you know the brain can adapt even to suffering, the next question becomes inevitable. How do we teach it to adapt to coherence, to joy, stillness, and higher order? That's where the science of inner alignment begins to unfold. The same mechanism that traps you in suffering can free you from it. Neuroplasticity has no moral code. It simply mirrors your repeated experiences. Once you understand this, the question shifts from "how do I stop suffering" to "how do I teach my brain something new?" The answer isn't resistance, but coherence, a state where thought, emotion, and body begin to vibrate in the same frequency of awareness. When suffering becomes habitual, the mind lives in fragmentation. Thoughts run one way, emotions another, and the body stays locked in old chemistry. Coherence is the opposite. It's the moment everything inside aligns toward presence. You feel it as a subtle quieting, a clarity that doesn't depend on external conditions. And that state isn't mystical, it's measurable. Functional MRI studies show that when people enter sustained attention or meditative awareness, neural activity in regions responsible for emotional regulation and empathy increases, while areas linked to fear and self-criticism decrease. The brain literally reorganizes around calm. Meditation, mindfulness, breathwork, these aren't just spiritual exercises, they are biological interventions. When you observe your inner state without judgment, you activate what neuroscientists call top-down regulation. The prefrontal cortex, the most evolved part of your brain, begins to modulate the emotional storms generated by the amygdala. Over time, this rewiring lowers baseline stress, reduces reactivity, and increases the sense of agency that trauma and repetition once took away. But you don't need to become a monk or isolate yourself in silence to do this. Reversal begins with one principle: attention is energy. Wherever you place it, life reorganizes around it. Every time you redirect your awareness from the narrative of pain to the sensation of presence, your breath, your heartbeat, the sound of the room, you're reminding your nervous system that safety exists outside the loop. Imagine your thoughts as ripples on a lake. Most people live in the ripples, reacting to every movement on the surface. But the practice of conscious observation lets you sink beneath it, into still water where the noise loses its grip. From that stillness, the brain learns a new default: rest instead of readiness, curiosity instead of defense. Neuroplasticity responds not just to what you focus on, but to how you focus. The combination of elevated emotion and clear attention creates what researchers call coherent frequency states. Gratitude, compassion, curiosity. These aren't sentimental ideas. They are electrical signals that synchronize brain and heart rhythms. When those rhythms align, hormonal balance follows. Cortisol drops, dopamine and oxytocin rise. The body begins to feel what safety truly is, not as an idea but as a sensation. And the brain, loyal to its environment, starts to map that feeling as the new normal. Here's the paradox: the less you chase change, the faster change occurs. Trying to fix your pain keeps attention anchored to it. Observing it without judgment lets the old circuitry fade from lack of energy. The moment you feel something uncomfortable, tension, sadness, restlessness, pause. Instead of labeling it or analyzing it, bring awareness to the raw physicality of it. Feel where it sits in your body. Breathe into that space without trying to move it away. What happens next is subtle but profound. Neurons that once fired automatically begin to desynchronize. The loop loses coherence. Through this quiet witnessing, you train the brain to tolerate stillness again. It learns that peace is not a void to fear, but a frequency to rest in. The nervous system recalibrates, moving from survival to regulation. You might notice small markers. Your breath deepens, your voice softens, your reactions slow down by half a second. That half second is everything. It's the birth of choice inside what used to be reflex. Science calls this experience-dependent plasticity. Every time you sustain awareness during discomfort, you're writing new code into the network. The hippocampus, responsible for contextual memory, begins to link safety with presence instead of danger. The anterior cingulate strengthens, allowing empathy to replace judgment. Even your heart rhythm changes. Coherence between heart and brain creates feedback loops that reinforce emotional stability. You start to embody calm instead of performing it. None of this happens overnight. The brain resists at first, it prefers its familiar suffering, but repetition in the opposite direction eventually takes hold. The same way the brain learned to normalize pain, it can normalize serenity. You begin to crave the quiet not as escape but as home. The more often you return to awareness, the more stable the neural architecture of peace becomes. Eventually, the pattern reverses. Instead of being addicted to stress, you become conditioned to presence. Instead of reacting, you respond. The self that once survived by tightening now begins to open. And the beauty of it is that this process never ends. It deepens. The more you practice conscious coherence, the more finely tuned your perception becomes. The next time you feel anxiety, don't rush to eliminate it. See if you can hold it in attention long enough to sense its rhythm. Beneath every pulse of discomfort lies intelligence, the brain testing, adjusting, adapting. The suffering wasn't punishment, it was rehearsal. Now you're teaching it a new song. And somewhere inside that song, a quiet realization begins to echo. If the brain can be trained towards suffering or serenity, then perhaps both are made of the same raw material, energy responding to awareness. That question, the nature of what awareness truly changes, opens the doorway to the next mystery, the one few dare to approach, the forbidden alignment between silence and transformation. There's a kind of inner silence that most people never touch, not because it's inaccessible, but because it feels too foreign, too intimate. It's the point where the mind stops producing explanations and the body stops anticipating the next moment. A stillness so deep it almost frightens the ego, as if disappearing into it might erase the you that's been narrating life all along. This is what could be called the forbidden alignment. The moment when awareness, emotion, and biology synchronize into one single movement of being. It's forbidden, not because it's hidden by some mystical law, but because our conditioning guards against it. The everyday mind is addicted to noise. It feeds on commentary, on labeling, planning, analyzing. Silence feels like death to that part of us, because silence reveals something the thinking self can't control. In stillness, identity loosens. The stories that once defined you, the successes, the failures, the titles, begin to fade like mist. What remains is not absence, but presence unfiltered by description. And for a mind built on continuity, that absence of narrative feels like danger. Yet this moment, the one the ego fears most, is the very threshold of transformation. Neuroscience describes it through the language of synchronization. When the brain enters sustained states of inner quiet, its electrical activity begins to shift from fragmented beta patterns into coherent alpha and theta waves. Regions that usually compete for dominance, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, the insula, start to communicate harmoniously. The self's internal conflict softens into unity. The irony is that nothing mystical happens here in the supernatural sense. What feels sacred is actually biological coherence, the nervous system, heart and brain operating in perfect rhythm. The prefrontal cortex, seat of higher reasoning, gently overrides the amygdala's primitive alarms. The body interprets this as safety so complete that defense mechanisms dissolve. The result is clarity, a consciousness unburdened by the constant need to protect its own image. But entering this alignment is not a technique, it's a surrender. You can't force stillness the way you force achievement. You arrive there by ceasing to interfere. The more you try to quiet the mind, the louder it becomes. It's only when you stop chasing control that the nervous system senses genuine permission to rest. And when it does, something extraordinary unfolds. The observer and the observed merge. You're no longer watching your thoughts. You're watching from within them, seeing their formation and dissolution as one fluid process. For a brief moment, the usual hierarchy collapses. The intellect that once commanded perception becomes an instrument of perception itself. Awareness flows through rather than above. It's not passivity, it's participation in its purest form. The sensation is almost physical, a widening in the chest, a soft expansion behind the eyes, a release in the gut. It's as if the body remembers how to breathe on its own terms again. Most people retreat at this point because the ego senses the ground shifting. Thoughts start whispering that something is being lost. You're spacing out, you're doing nothing, you're disappearing. And in a sense, that's true. The version of self that survives through constant narrative is dissolving. But what replaces it isn't emptiness. It's awareness without boundaries. It feels like standing at the edge of thought and seeing that everything, even thinking, is part of a single field of movement. This alignment carries both beauty and danger. The beauty is freedom, the realization that you are not the sum of your reactions. The danger is misinterpretation. Some mistake this stillness for detachment, for a void that cancels the world. But real silence doesn't erase life, it heightens it. When the noise of thought recedes, senses sharpen. Colors seem more vivid, sounds more layered, touch more immediate. It's as if reality becomes high definition, not because it changed, but because perception finally stopped filtering it. And then something even more curious occurs. When the brain enters this coherence, the heart follows. Electrocardiography has shown that the heart generates its own rhythmic field that interacts with brain waves. In states of compassion, gratitude, or meditative awareness, these rhythms align, creating what researchers at the HeartMath Institute call heart-brain coherence. The organism begins to function like a single resonant instrument. Emotion, once reactive, becomes harmonic. Intuition starts to emerge not as fantasy, but as intelligence felt in the body. This is why ancient traditions spoke of the mind descending into the heart. It wasn't poetry, it was neurophysiology described through metaphor. The alignment of head and heart creates a feedback loop that strengthens equilibrium. The nervous system stops oscillating between fight and flight and enters a state of creative readiness. You no longer react, you respond. You no longer seek control, you perceive balance. But the mind that has been conditioned to survive through chaos rarely accepts this peace easily. It will test it. It will throw thoughts like stones into the silence just to see if the stillness holds. And that testing is necessary. It's how the ego learns that quiet doesn't mean extinction, it means evolution. So the forbidden alignment is not something you achieve once, it's a space you keep rediscovering each time you stop defending your old identity. Each return strengthens the neural coherence that makes presence sustainable. And as this coherence stabilizes, something remarkable begins to reveal itself. What you've been calling spiritual awakening is not separate from your biology. It's written into it. Because the next truth waiting beyond this silence is perhaps the most disruptive of all. That what we name spiritual is not above the body but within it. The sacred isn't metaphysical, it's physical. The spiritual brain is not a metaphor, but a measurable reality, preparing even now to take command over everything primitive that came before. For centuries, humanity drew a line between the spiritual and the scientific, as if one belonged to mystery and the other to matter. But the closer neuroscience looks, the more that line dissolves. What ancient mystics called awakening isn't floating light or cosmic poetry. It's biology doing what it was built to do. The spiritual brain is not ethereal, it's anatomical. Inside your skull sits the machinery of transcendence. When meditation deepens, when compassion expands, when you experience awe so vast that words fall away, it's the prefrontal cortex that lights up. This region, the seat of attention, empathy, and moral reasoning, begins to assert command over the older, more primitive structures that evolved to fight, flee, or freeze. What feels like rising above emotion is actually a transfer of power. Higher cognition regulating ancient fear circuits. Functional MRI studies of long-term meditators have shown consistent patterns. Activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm bell, diminishes, while the prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortices strengthen. Connectivity between hemispheres increases, and regions linked to self-referential thought, the default mode network, quiet down. The subjective experience of ego dissolution, that spacious sense of unity, is mirrored by a measurable synchronization of neural rhythms. The mystical is measurable. The divine has coordinates. It's a startling reversal. Spirituality doesn't transcend biology. It perfects it. The brain, far from being a limitation, is the medium through which transcendence expresses itself. The circuitry of compassion, gratitude, and insight are not metaphors, but electrical realities. When you feel love that asks for nothing, when forgiveness arises without effort, those are not abstractions. They are shifts in neurotransmission, surges of serotonin and oxytocin, waves of gamma coherence binding regions of thought and feeling into a single lucid field. This is the new sacred, not beyond the flesh but through it. Consciousness refines matter by inhabiting it fully. Every deep breath, every moment of presence is a micro-adjustment of the brain's internal architecture. The neurons are listening. The body isn't a cage, it's the instrument through which awareness learns to play its most complex melody. It changes everything. Enlightenment is not a supernatural gift, it's a biological potential coded into the species. The so-called spiritual path is the nervous system discovering higher order within itself. The miracle is not that thought can reach the divine, it's that tissue can. And when the brain achieves coherence, it doesn't escape the physical world, it reveals it as sacred. But this revelation brings a new question. If the brain is capable of such transformation, what exactly triggers it? What moment tells the neurons, now reorganize, now evolve? The answer isn't in chanting or doctrine, it's in something quieter, simpler, almost invisible, the instant when observation becomes pure. The brain doesn't need belief to change. It needs awareness so steady that reaction collapses. Because the next secret waiting to unfold is this: the reconfiguration doesn't happen through effort or ecstasy, but in the most ordinary of miracles, the moment you simply see without trying to change. The brain's most profound transformation doesn't unfold in lightning flashes of revelation. It happens in silence, when you're simply watching your own experience without rushing to interfere. That's the simple practice, the hidden trigger behind conscious neuroplasticity. Observation without reaction. Every time you witness a thought rise and fall without grasping it, the brain interprets it as new data. A different network begins to activate. The insula, which tracks inner sensations, the prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotional charge, and the hippocampus, which integrates memory with context. Together, they form what could be called the circuitry of awareness. And in that awareness, something radical occurs. The old reactive circuits weaken, while new ones, those linked to clarity, patience, and equanimity, start to fire in their place. It's not meditation in the traditional sense. You don't need to close your eyes or light a candle. The practice begins exactly where you are. A sensation tightens your chest, a memory surfaces, a thought rushes in. Instead of resisting or following it, you feel it fully. You let the body experience the emotion as vibration, as movement, as chemistry. No interpretation, no correction, just pure observation. In that instant, the brain receives a signal it rarely hears: safety in stillness. The nervous system learns that presence itself is not a threat. The amygdala calms, the heart rate steadies, and the vagus nerve, the bridge between mind and body, sends messages of regulation through your entire being. Each time this happens, you're teaching the brain to respond rather than react, to remain open rather than contract. This is attention-dependent neuroplasticity at work. The neurons responsible for the old reflex lose strength through lack of reinforcement. New pathways emerge around them, mapping a subtle intelligence that doesn't need defense to feel safe. Over time, you begin to notice gaps between stimulus and response, spaces where choice quietly exists. What was once automatic becomes conscious. The architecture of self-control begins to form not through willpower, but through awareness that no longer flinches. If you could watch this process in real time, you'd see microscopic storms of electricity slowing, synchronizing. The rhythm of the brain becomes more coherent, like waves settling into pattern after chaos. This coherence doesn't erase emotion, it refines it. You still feel, but you're no longer ruled by what you feel. The emotion moves through, not into you. The paradox of this practice is that it feels like doing nothing, yet it changes everything. Observation reorganizes the system from the inside out. The more often you return to that stance of still witnessing, the more your brain begins to prefer it. It learns that awareness is home. And the deeper you rest in this home, the more you start to wonder what exactly is observing. If the brain can change itself through simple awareness, what is this awareness made of? Is it just another function of the mind, or something vaster, something that rewires not only neurons but identity itself? That question, the quiet shock of realizing that consciousness may be the architect of the brain it watches, is where the next revelation begins to form, waiting to turn the mirror fully inward. Now pause for a moment and consider this. If the brain can reconfigure itself even when you're not aware of it, what is it doing right now as you read these words? Neurons are firing, memories are being tagged, tiny electrical impulses are rearranging pathways that didn't exist a few minutes ago. You are not the same person who began this reading. The transformation is already in motion, quiet, microscopic, irreversible. This is the twist most people never realize. The brain doesn't wait for permission to evolve. It adapts to every act of attention. Simply by observing, you've changed the system, observing itself. Awareness is both participant and catalyst. The organ inside your skull is not just processing information, it's sculpting identity in real time. Every perception alters the perceiver. Think about how intimate that is. A single moment of genuine presence, a sigh, a sentence, a fleeting realization, reaches into the physical structure of your brain and edits it. Synapses strengthen or dissolve. Chemical balances shift. Entire networks rearrange around what you notice. Existence isn't happening to you, it's happening through you. Consciousness is not the passenger, it's the sculptor wearing the mask of experience. And yet, this miracle carries a strange weight. If everything you focus on reshapes the brain, then you are constantly creating yourself, even when you're unaware of doing it. Every thought you nurture, every emotion you rehearse, every silence you allow, it all becomes anatomy. You are being rewritten by your own attention. What you contemplate, you become. The emotional gravity of that truth can be dizzying. It means responsibility no longer lives in morality or behavior, it lives in awareness. The next thought you choose to believe, the next feeling you refuse to fight is a message to your biology. Build more of this. The mind is not a container, it's a construction site, and the foreman is your focus. Still, there's tenderness in this realization, because it also means you've never been stuck. The habits, fears, and stories you thought defined you were just neural echoes repeating themselves until awareness interrupted. Even the pain that seemed permanent was nothing more than energy trained into form, and form by nature can be remade. So here you stand, or rather are, in the quiet aftermath of understanding. The same brain that once imprisoned you in repetition is now capable of releasing you through perception. The same mechanism that adapted to suffering can adapt to grace. All it needs is direction, and that direction begins in observation. Somewhere inside this realization, a small voice of wonder begins to rise. If the brain can change itself simply by being seen, then what else could consciousness change by noticing? Where does the power of awareness end, if it ends at all? That question is not meant to be answered, but inhabited. It opens like a door you've already stepped through without realizing. Behind it, something vast and intimate waits, the understanding that evolution was never external. It's happening in every cell, every breath, every moment you remember to see. The truth is simple, yet infinite in depth. Your brain reconfigures itself every single day. Most people never notice it happening. They sleepwalk through their own evolution. But those who stay awake, who learn to watch rather than react, begin to guide the current instead of being carried by it. Every breath of awareness, every moment of still presence, is a new architecture forming within you. You're not waiting to change, you are the change unfolding from the inside out. If this journey opens something in you, leave a sign of it below. Write, "I am rewiring consciously." It's how I'll know you've reached the end of this path. And if you want to keep expanding, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one is another doorway into this same mystery, the living science of awareness reshaping the mind that observes it.